She is passionate about empowering people to find pragmatic solutions for the problems of the world. So now I'd like to hand over the panel to our moderator, Martha Valenta from 1904 Labs, and have a good time, guys.
Great, thanks for joining us. We did have a little bit of a hiccup in the Facebook Live just now, so I'm going to briefly do what Carol just did. Anita is an awesome person. She's in the Coder Girl UX cohort, and she's the mother of a 4-year-old. She's just jumping into the world of IEPs with her fabulous child. And she's Anita Fitzwater-Stevens. Brett Miller is the solution designer at DSA Incorporated and works with large federal agency to develop user-centric social business solutions to solve big problems. He's a neo-generalist with a broad set of skills and experience, and he's an Army veteran. He lived in Europe for several years and has been married for 30 years. He's a father of 2, an avid rock climber, and he approaches challenges and opportunities from all perspectives to ensure outcomes that are a win-win. Eva Tucker is a business owner who works alongside organizations to build their online presence. Eva is the mom of 2 boys. She's a congressional advocate for Alzheimer's, and she's the regional leader of the St. Louis chapter of Lean In. She's passionate about empowering people to find pragmatic solutions for the problems of the world. So we've got an amazing panel here. Would you like to start with some items that you have prepared, or would you like to start with questions? It's up to you.
Well, no, I think one of the things that doesn't show up in my in that bio, my older son Zeke is autistic, and so he's in his mid-20s now. So we're a little bit past the IEP stage, but we had quite a bit of experience. We lived in Kansas when he was first diagnosed as autistic, so we worked with the school district there. Then we moved to New Jersey. Army moves you around, and so we had experience there with a couple of different programs. I ended up actually leaving active duty in the military because the Army wanted to send me somewhere that he wouldn't get the supports he needed, and he was in such a great program there. And then when we moved back to St. Louis, he was at high school age, so he's starting high school. And so we went through that IEP process with the special school district here, and then Parkway North High School, which I can't say enough good things about. We were very fortunate. We had good experiences with the IEP. I know not everyone does, and that's part of why we wanted to talk about this.
Great. And what is an IEP? Let's define that again, just real quick.
Sure. So an IEP is an individualized education program that is mandated by the Americans with Disabilities Act for those children who need extra supports. Any student really who receives special education services will get an IEP. And there's varying types and different aspects to it, but that's the basics.
Great.
So my experience with the IEP process, as Martha said, I have 2 sons. My youngest son is 4 years old, and he was born with a rare genetic condition. So he has hearing loss, he has cerebral palsy, and global developmental delays. So he has a full range of therapists, and he started off at a hearing impaired school when he was 3 months old, and then he transitioned into the Fox School District when he was 3, and that's when we started the IEP process. So far, it's went pretty well with him. I also have another son who I recently pulled out of school to homeschool because he was having issues in school. He's more on the gifted end of the spectrum and an asynchronous learner, and he didn't really fit into the school district, so that's been a whole different experience.
Great.
Well, my son is 4, and he's just starting an IEP process with the Clayton School District. They developed some individual program for him last spring, and he started in a regular class in their preschool program this fall. So far, it's been fairly good, although I will say that in terms of collaboration, I think there is definitely room for improvement.
Great. And so I understand you guys did a survey in preparation for this event. Can you tell me about that survey and what the results were?
Well, we put together a survey basically just to reach out to parents and members of the community who have experience with IEPs. We wanted to get parents, students, administrative professionals, and educators, and all of them to give us their thoughts on how collaborative they felt the process was and how well they felt that they reached their goals and how satisfied they were with it on the whole. We had a lot of comments. I would say we got, 40 to 60 responses?
Like 45 when I looked.
Yeah, and a lot of the people thankfully went ahead and did comment and enlarge on just the basic questions that we asked. So we didn't just have numbers responses.
Great.
Can I-
Yeah.
Just real quick, too, I mean, the basic demographics, when you look at it, about 50%, I think a little over 50% of the respondents were parents. And it's kind of typical when you're talking about IEPs because, I mean, parents obviously are very passionate, want to advocate for their children, and are trying to get as much information as they can, whereas school districts, administrators, teachers generally have the backing of the system, right? There's legal advice. I mean, it's very hard to get people to comment publicly about specifics of an IEP process. So it wasn't unexpected that most of the responses were parents. As Anita said, it was a mix of good and bad. There were a couple that were, like my experience here with SSD and Parkway North, they were very good. Everything worked out. And then there's some that were just, awful. I mean, one of the comments was along the lines of, the school district, did the bare minimum they had to do to meet the law. And someone actually said in their IEP meeting, well, this is legal enough, so we're done. And so that's a level of frustration that a lot of parents, unfortunately, still have.
I haven't seen the results, but I was just going to say, with my son, my youngest son, we had a good advocate with us. In the director of his hearing impaired school went with us when we went into the school district. So we had somebody experienced alongside with us, and I think that helped them take us more seriously too, and both the schools ended up collaborating. So we ended up having a good experience as well. But I don't know how different that would have been if I hadn't had an advocate alongside me that had more experience, because I really didn't know what I was doing, and I still don't. Now we're going from preschool into elementary, and I'm afraid it's going to be a different process because I'm going to be alone this time, and I'm going to be with a different group of people that have different parameters around what they can offer as well. It's a different environment going from an early childhood center to going into elementary school. So
Sure.
I think it could probably change as you go up through your education as well, different experiences.
So would you like to talk about, I just want to remind everybody on Facebook that you're free to ask questions via the Facebook Live. So please do. Feel free to ask either one of the panelists or all of them any question that you might have, because this is intended to be interactive. So integration versus inclusion. Talk to me about that topic.
Well, one of the most telling things that I think sums it up is a graphic that we found online, and if Brett can pull that up, we can put that on the screen. What we're primarily looking at in terms of integration versus inclusion is integration is simply placing the kids in a mainstream environment without regard for specific strengths or weaknesses that they have. And in many cases, keeping them sort of clumped together so they all go through the same classes, they all go to the same lunch period. The focus is on them being a separate pod within the larger group of the school. And what we want to aim for is inclusion, which meets each student where they are and attends to their specific abilities and needs.
And I think this gets to one of the key things in an IEP, and as part of the process as well, is something known as the least restrictive environment. I have another slide here. I don't know if you can see it. And at home, look it on Wikipedia or any search on Google. But the basic idea when you see it here is that the goal is to have every student participate as fully in all aspects of education as possible, not just the academics. And I think one of the things that led me to want to talk about this today is that most IEPs really focus just on the academics and some very specific sets of skills. They'll look at each child and they look at their deficits and how do we overcome those deficits instead of looking at that larger picture. And then sometimes I think in these IEP processes, this mandate for the least restrictive environment sometimes gets forgotten. I mean, for instance, being in the school environment with other students, the whole process from riding the bus, right? I mean, we've all heard about the short bus, right? And people make jokes about the short bus. Well, I mean, that's an example of integration versus inclusion, right? It's like, yeah, they're going to the school, but they're going to ride a separate bus and they're going to come in at a separate location. And so everyone knows who they are and they're just kind of separated like that. And so when we talk about inclusion, especially through a user experience in that broad sense, what does that student's day look like from the time they get in their parents' car or on the bus to the time they show up at school, they transition to class, they go to lunch, they go to PE, after school activities, which often get forgotten about in IEPs. And so that's really what we're kind of thinking when we think inclusion versus integration.
Sure. So what would it look like with regard to with inclusion? What would that look like with regard to an IEP? Any of you that have thoughts on this? Like, how does it work today and how might it work in the future?
I can speak on my personal experience with my son. Like I said, he has all the different therapists, and when he first started in his school district, they would pull him out of class a lot of times for his different therapies, but he was really getting started, and sometimes that was necessary. But he's been there, this is his third year, he just started there. And they're starting to, as he's progressing and as they're seeing where he needs help and where they can, they're pulling him into the classroom more often. And sometimes they're even bringing his therapist into the classroom with him so that they can work alongside him and he can still interact with the other students.
Yeah, I think that presence of the therapist accompanying the student into the classroom and keeping them within their peer group as much as possible is probably one of the biggest changes that in some good school districts that we're seeing. And I don't know if anyone else wants to out their age, but when I went to school, and I graduated in 1995, and at that point in time, special education was completely separate. The kids had separate teachers. They didn't have any social interaction with kids their peer group. They ate lunch by themselves. They had all of the non-academic classes like gym and in some cases art by themselves. There was none of that social component. And I think that as education has moved, public education has moved from its industrial origins of getting kids ready to work in a factory, they may gradually see more of that.
So each of you has a different level of experience in user experience, human-centered design, or IT systems. And I'm wondering how have you applied that, or have you considered applying that, if you will, design thinking or service experience design to your child's education or to the idea of an IEP in general?
I have not used those skills in this area of my life, but actually as we were talking about this and we met a few times through some conference calls and you were showing some mind mapping, I really had a revelation in that, because when we're in the IEP meetings, I get this stack of papers that's like this thick where we're going through his progress, his goals, all these percentages, and I'm having to make, and we're flipping through them, and we're going around the table to all the therapists, and I'm having to make all these decisions, and I haven't really necessarily had time to think about them. I'm hearing his progress. We're coming up with the new goals, looking at all this at once, and it's through this giant stack of papers. But when we were looking at different mind maps around IEPs, it was really interesting to me how you could see all the different realms at once, and how seeing it visually like that helped me wrap my head around it, and how you could incorporate that into the meeting so it's not so overwhelming, and that because you need to take a lot into consideration at once, and it's hard when you're going through there, and there's 10 people in the meeting with my son, and some people have places to go. We have to make it through this thing in an hour, but we're planning out his whole year. So I think there's definitely room there to switch up the process a little bit, or even how we look at the information, to make it easier to make those decisions and not overwhelm you so much.
Sure, visualization can help with very complex ideas and problems to make them more digestible, right?
This is very complex, and there's a lot of aspects that have to do with the school, and also to do with your own child and their specific needs. And like you were saying, there's different realms where you're thinking about the academics, you're thinking about how they transitioned in the classroom. I think there's a lot of room for improvement there.
Sure.
Yeah, and I think for me, for me, I mean, my career over the last 15 or 20 years, I've been a systems engineer, so doing systems thinking. And so when Zeke was in school and we were going through this whole thing, and even my younger son Ian, I mean, looking at how the education process works, as a system, how all of the parts kind of fit together, and how to make it work as a whole. So for me, I mean, that was just kind of second nature. That's just generally how I see problems. And so when I look at it, again, using transportation and the buses as an example, how if you put yourself in the shoes of the school district, and the transportation budget they have, and how many buses can they have, and is there a requirement to pick the student up at their door, or can they walk down to the neighborhood bus stop? That determines what transportation they can have. I live in the Parkway School District, right? And so they use the same buses for elementary, middle, and high school, and so the start times in each of the schools are staggered to accommodate reusing those buses and drivers. So instead of having to have, say, 24 bus drivers, they have 8 bus drivers that do 3 rounds, right? And so those are the types of things as a parent that it's useful to consider when you're thinking about what it is that your student needs, and what kind of services you're demanding. One of the comments on the survey we got was from someone who is both a parent and a teacher involved in IEPs, and one of the comments from the teacher aspect was frustration with parents who are asking for the world because they want the world for their child, when it's not necessarily reasonable to expect that for that specific child.
Well, I think that's part of what I'm doing with Launch Code, is continuing to build my skills in user experience and designing interactions. And from my perspective as a parent who's both acquiring those skills and just becoming familiar with the IEP process, it's interesting to me how important it is to be willing. From a design aspect, you want to be able to cooperate with your developers and not put too much cognitive load on their plate. And I think the same thing is true with the teachers. You want to encourage them to create specific goals for your child, but you also want to help them realize how they can get there. And that's one of the biggest ways I think my education is helping me in this process.
Now, you've spoken a lot about parents and how the parents responded to the survey, and other information you might have about parents from that perspective. What do you have about the perspective of the educator or the student?
Yeah, I don't really remember specifically because I didn't correlate the responses with the type exactly. You can kind of tell from some of them. But I think from a teacher's perspective, Eva mentioned the time constraints and how rushed the meetings are and how hard it is to get things done. Because we all know that teachers and school administrators, especially in public school districts, are just completely stressed for time and overworked anyway. And so being able to take the time to prepare ahead of time, to be able to collaborate outside of the 30-minute meeting. Because like Eva says, what ends up happening usually is they will email you. Today they'll email it. In the good old days they would snail mail it, and you would look at it, and the first time you had to talk about it was when the 10 of you were sitting around the table together. And there was no overarching you didn't have an idea of the overall outcome. What you had was, he gets 30 minutes once a week of speech therapy and, 10 minutes 5 times a week. Sometimes he gets pulled out of class, or sometimes someone will come into the class. And it's hard to make sense of how that fits into, the big picture of the student's experience at school beyond those, very discrete academic ideas.
We have an educator here, and I don't know if they want to remain anonymous, so I'm just going to pass the mic because I think there's some questions.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm a school psychologist, so we're kind of in this place of being stuck between wanting to do the best thing for students and parents and interact with them in a way that is clear and concise and really makes it all transparent, but our hands are often tied by the higher up, like Department of Education, legal red tape as far as what we're allowed to do and how we're allowed to do it. And it's a frustrating place to be in, just speaking as somebody who's in the more education realm of this, wanting to provide the world for kids, but really being stuck. But it's interesting to think about, like, a parent sitting in a meeting who doesn't come from this world, making sure that maybe offering a pre-meeting before the IEP to give them a preview of what you're going to talk about and what those goals might look like, so that they have a chance to digest that information before that 1 hour meeting that they're limited to. So,
great, thank you very much.
If I can, just
Sure.
Just on that, one of the things as we were going through this and preparing for this, and trying to look at it in service design context, was the idea of who is the customer, right, of the IEP, which leads you to the question, really, who is the customer of the education system, right? And so that, if you look at it, is the taxpayer, right? And it's not really the taxpayer so much as it is society, because that's why we have the schools to. That's why taxpayer money goes to fund these schools, so that kids come out that can be a part of society and contribute in whatever way that they do. But at the same time, those customers are not the users of the service that is the school and the education. And so for teachers especially, and counselors are kind of they really are in the middle, because they're the ones providing the basic service. But you have school administrators, who report to the school board, who report to the taxpayers because they get elected in most places, right? And so they look at it from that standpoint. And then you have parents on the opposite spectrum who are, rightfully focused on their specific, outcome, their investment, which is, their child.
So how might a parent use service design and think about the front of the stage, or the front of the house and the back of the house, to negotiate better for their child, or needs that they feel their child isn't having met, knowing that there are all these different parts?
I just had one thing I wanted to add. I think when we're talking about all the parts, one thing is, when you're going into those meetings, especially, my son's still fairly young, you don't really know what the options are when you go in. You don't know what the constraints are for all the parties involved. You know, they offer a certain amount of physical therapy for my son, and I don't know if that's standard, if I could ask for more. I don't, and I am somebody who is thinking about the different people involved, and I understand, you know, not only thinking about myself and my son. I know that the teachers have constraints, but sometimes I don't really feel prepared to be like, hey, is that enough physical therapy? Can he have more physical therapy? How much do other kids get? How much time do you have available? I mean, if there's some way of more clearly clearly outlining what the options are, and where we can be flexible, where we can't, I think that would be helpful in having the conversation and feeling prepared.
Sure, I completely agree. Actually, when my own child was in school, we were told that if she wouldn't take her medication, she couldn't be on the IEP. I later, much later, too late, found that that was a lie. She could totally be on an IEP even if she didn't take the medication. The medication was for ADD, and it made her feel suicidal, so it was pretty critical to me that she not take the medication. And so there needs to be maybe a resource, and I wonder if there is one. Are you aware of a resource for parents to know what their rights are and what is available and what is acceptable?
Yeah, so I don't think there's necessarily a guide as to like a standardized form for how many minutes are provided for this therapy or that therapy, or how often the student's pulled out, or how often the teacher pushes in. We hand out in every meeting what's called like the Parents' Bill of Rights and a guide to special education in the state of Missouri, and it is dry. It is legal reading material. It is not user-friendly, especially if you're working with parents who might come from a background where they lack education. Maybe their reading comprehension skills are low. I mean, we often see kids who are struggling, and we have parents who also struggled in school. So that's an area that I think could really use improvement.
If I can, Martha, just,
Yes.
I mean, along those lines, a couple of the comments that we had on the survey, and just from personal experience and knowing friends and people through all the years, is, one of the recommendations is have someone who can act as an advocate. Like Eva mentioned, she had someone from, previous school to go with her to another one to act, on the child's behalf, basically. Because, again, the school districts and teachers are very familiar with the process because they do it all the time. And it's easy. I think we all know, I mean, with cognitive bias, it's very easy to assume that everyone knows what you know, and forget that this may be the first time that they're sitting through it. And after you go through it for 15 years, you get more familiar with it, you know what's being said, and you can kind of understand, what is meant by certain things when they say it. And the Bill of Rights, Parents' Bill of Rights, it's very basic. This is what you're entitled to under the law, but it doesn't, like I said, if you don't understand it, it doesn't mean anything. And even if you understand it, a lot of times it doesn't really say anything, right, in terms of, meeting the specific needs of individual children.
Sure, and it's interesting, even Eva had an experience with it with her first child, and then coming into it with her second child, it's still a challenge.
With my older son, I think I had a similar situation with you, where we couldn't get an IEP unless we had a diagnosis, but I didn't feel that I felt like we were going to be misdiagnosing him. And so my hands were tied, and I couldn't get a lot of answers about, okay, if I do go through this process and we get this diagnosis, what's it going to look like? And all I could get was people, whether it be educators or doctors, giving me these stories about people hesitating to medicate their kids and, whatever happened, and all these horror stories. And it didn't have anything to do with my son. And I was like, I'm not trying to medicate him. He's in kindergarten, and so I was very distrustful of the whole process, and I didn't go through with it because I just felt like it was this elaborate scheme to get me to medicate him, and I didn't know nobody could tell me what other options existed for him beyond the medication. And in my gut, I felt like we were pushing a diagnosis that didn't fit him. And so there was nothing they could do to help him, even though he did have some issues in the classroom. The issues that they were talking about in the classroom, I agreed with them. I wanted to support him, and I was willing to do anything I needed to do to help support him beyond, misdiagnosing him and giving him medication that I didn't think that he needed at too young of an age. And that's not saying that some kids don't need it. I know kids that do, but it was just my personal situation, and we kept trying, and we eventually decided to homeschool him because it wasn't working for him.
So, I believe everybody on this panel is involved in uses social media extensively, and is involved in various groups that are on social media. Have any of you utilized social media in order to find other parents going through similar situations?
Well, at the risk of dating myself and aging myself here, when we were going through this process first with Zeke, especially in New Jersey after we had just moved there, this is, the World Wide Web was still very, very young. AOL was all the rage, and Usenet was what you had. So, but yeah, we did. That is how we learned what we needed to know and met the people we needed to meet in order to get him the services that he needed. Because there is out there a large community of parents who share, bloggers and support groups and discussion groups, and I'm sure there's a bunch of them on Facebook. Yeah, we were beyond needing Facebook groups like this by the time Facebook groups came around. Mm-hmm. So I never had a chance to use those, but I'm still friends and active with others who have kids who are doing that, and so definitely, social media is definitely a great resource.
Great.
Well, I think one of the primary barriers to finding other parents that you can engage with and that can help you realize things like you should take an advocate with you to IEP meetings is that socially we're not really encouraged to discuss our kids' diagnoses. And some of that, I think, is just fair because you don't want to tell your child's story if they wouldn't want their story out there. But because it's so culturally prevalent, it works against us. It works against us as parents. It works against us as individual advocates for our children. And one of the things that social media has done is it has enabled us to start to break that down, because you can have those conversations without the person on the other end knowing everything about you and knowing who your kid necessarily is to pick them out and make an object of them.
Sure.
Well, and just if I can on that too, one of the things that social media today does, and to Anita's point, is you have access now to basically the entire world of parents, and it may or may not be someone in your local town, because most of the issues, most of the things that parents need to know that they want to know isn't about a specific case or about a specific school district. It's really about the process in general, and in that way, just social media in general, I think, has been a great tool.
Okay.
I haven't used social media to talk about the IEP process, but for my youngest son, we have connected to various rare disease communities and communities around his various disabilities, and that has been very beneficial. The parents that I talk to know more than the doctors most of the time, and I think that I probably should talk about IEPs more often, because probably some of those questions that I was talking about earlier, where I don't know how many minutes there are acceptable and what other kids are getting, those probably could be had with other parents, and I would probably get a lot more information and feel better prepared.
Great. So from these segments that we're having today, we'd like to finish up with a call to action. What can people do from what they've learned here today, the information they've learned, how can we create the change that we're seeking, assuming that we're seeking change? What are your thoughts around that?
Well, I feel bad. You had asked a question earlier about parents and service design and how we do it, and we kind of I think I got us off track. I have a bad habit of doing that. But the image that's on the screen now shows some examples of maps that are used in UX design and service design. And Eva talked about a mind map that we had done before. It was really, it was like a very rough version of say a customer journey map, and what we had talked about earlier of what does a typical school day look like for every student, and then how do you design the service, how do you apply these techniques to that process to make sure that even kids that need special education can benefit from that. And so when you look at these maps, the first one is an empathy map, right? And I think that's a lot of what gets forgotten is what does the student think? What does the student feel? When students are older, when they're in high school, you can ask them, and the way the IEP process works, when they turn 14 or 16, I think students are supposed to be brought into the IEP process to be an active part of the team because they're getting ready to transition into adulthood. And I think one of the things that parents can do and should do, and something that we always tried to do, was get the rest of the IEP team to see Zeke for Zeke. He's autistic. Yes, he's a quote unquote disabled child, but he's a kid. He's a kid going to school. He wants what other kids want, and so start with that.
So we might encourage parents to seek out an empathy map online. I know that X-Plane has an excellent empathy map that shows not only what they say, think, feel, or do a user, but also sometimes goals and items that might block them from those goals. So that sounds like an excellent step that parents could take with their own child, also with themselves and with their teachers, possibly. Okay?
I know what my personal action items are from participating in this. I'm definitely going to start using mind mapping to get out my own thoughts about what my kids need and what their strengths and weaknesses are, and I'm going to better use social media to connect with other parents.
Great. So if you have some results, if you happen to create a group, please share with us, and we'll post that to the page that we've created.
Yeah, and the tool, was it MindMeister, was the tool that we were using, and I did a search on there. I just searched IEP, and there was a lot of results for other people that were using it, and it gave me a lot of ideas about how I could use it for myself. So I think that it's a good way to just, even if it's just having a brain dump so that you feel like you're going into the meeting with some clarity, or that you can get your message across quickly, mind mapping could be really helpful.
Great.
I think the biggest thing I would say that we want people to be implementing in this is don't be afraid to ask questions. When you go into a school setting, in so many cases, you're accepting them as the authority that is handing down something that you should be grateful for. And instead of looking at it like that, look at it as, what questions can I ask? How can we continue to improve this? And don't view that one IEP meeting as the end of the process. View it as one step in it. Take notes, take an advocate, but mainly ask a lot of questions.
Great. Fantastic. I think that's going to conclude this particular segment. So, round of applause for our panelists.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you. My pleasure. We'll be back in about 15 minutes.